The sun was setting over the busy streets of East Bridge, casting long shadows between the aging apartment buildings. Every day after school, young Tommy Martinez would walk these familiar streets with his worn-out backpack slung over one shoulder and a large plastic bag in his hand. At just 12 years old, he had already mastered the art of spotting valuable recyclables among the city's discarded trash. "See you tomorrow, Mrs. Lee," Tommy called out, waving to the elderly shopkeeper who always saved her empty soda cans for him. She smiled warmly, her wrinkled face lighting up as she watched him continue his daily route. She often worried about the young boy, who seemed to carry the weight of adult responsibilities on his small shoulders. Tommy's afternoon routine was like clockwork. He would finish his classes at East Bridge Elementary, quickly pack up his things, and begin his journey through the neighborhood. While other kids his age headed to soccer practice or piano lessons, Tommy had a different mission. His mom worked 2 jobs to keep food on their table, and he was determined to help in any way he could. The old pedestrian bridge that connected downtown to his neighborhood was Tommy's favorite spot. Business people rushing home would often toss their empty coffee cups and water bottles there, not knowing that their trash would help put food on someone's table. Tommy had learned to time his visits perfectly. Right after the evening rush hour, when the bridge was quieter but still held treasures from the day's commuters. As he walked along the bridge that day, Tommy thought about his mom. She had dark circles under her eyes from working late shifts at the diner, but she never complained. Every morning, she still managed to pack his lunch and give him a warm hug before sending him off to school. The thought of her made him work even harder, carefully checking every recycling bin and picking up every can he could find. His classmates sometimes made fun of him, calling him trash boy behind his back. But Tommy didn't care. He knew what he was doing was important. Each evening, he would sort through his findings in their small apartment. Aluminum cans in one pile, plastic bottles in another. The recycling center wasn't much, but the few dollars he earned helped buy groceries or pay for his school supplies. That particular afternoon felt different somehow. The autumn wind was stronger than usual, whipping through the bridge's metal framework with an eerie whistle. The sky had turned a deep orange, and most people had already hurried home. Tommy adjusted his jacket, pulling it tighter against the cold. His bag was only half full, but something told him to stay a little longer. Looking at his worn-out sneakers, Tommy remembered how his mom had offered to buy him new ones last week. He had pretended these still fit perfectly, knowing the rent was due soon. Instead of showing how much his toes pinch, he had just smiled and told her these were his lucky shoes. The memory made him more determined to fill his bag before heading home. Little did Tommy know that his ordinary afternoon was about to become extraordinary. As the street lights began flickering to life and the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant shades of purple and gold, fate was about to step onto that bridge with him. In just a few moments, his simple act of being there would change not only his life, but someone else's too. The wind was getting stronger as evening crept in, making the old bridge creak and groan. Tommy had just finished checking his usual spots when something caught his eye. A tall figure standing near the edge. At first, he thought it was just another person taking in the view of the city lights starting to twinkle in the distance. But something felt off. The man stood perfectly still, his expensive suit jacket fluttering wildly in the wind like a flag caught in a storm. He was gripping the railing so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Even from a distance, Tommy could tell this wasn't someone admiring the sunset. This was someone in pain. Tommy remembered what his mom always said about being careful around strangers, but he also remembered her saying that sometimes people just need someone to show they care. The man swayed slightly, and Tommy's heart jumped into his throat. Without thinking, he took a few steps closer, trying to get a better look. The man's face was wet, maybe from tears, maybe from the light drizzle that had started to fall. His shoes probably cost more than everything Tommy owned, but right now he looked as lost as the stray cats that roamed Tommy's neighborhood. A fancy watch glinted on his wrist as he leaned forward slightly, making Tommy's stomach twist with worry. Other people walked past, heads down, absorbed in their phones or hurrying to get home. It was like they had invisible blindfolds on, not seeing what was happening right in front of them. Or maybe they saw but didn't want to get involved. Tommy watched as a businessman in a hurry actually walked around the man without even glancing his way. The man's breathing was becoming more rapid and uneven. Tommy could hear it now that he was closer. It reminded him of how his mom sounded that time she got really bad news about Grandma being sick, like someone trying not to cry but failing. The man's legs were shaking, and he kept looking down at the dark water below. Tommy's plastic bag of recyclables suddenly felt very heavy in his hand. He should probably just go home. His mom would be worried if he was late. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way the man's shoulders shook, or how he seemed to be talking to himself in a broken whisper that the wind carried away. The street lights had fully come on now, casting strange shadows across the bridge. In their glow, Tommy could see that the man was older, probably around 50, with gray streaks in his dark hair. His face was lined with wrinkles that seemed carved by sadness rather than age. Despite his expensive clothes, he looked somehow smaller and more fragile than a man his size should. A passing car's headlights illuminated the scene for a brief moment, and Tommy saw something that made his blood run cold. The man had started to lift one foot onto the lower rail. Time seemed to slow down. The world narrowed to just this moment, just this bridge, just this choice. Tommy knew that what he did next would matter more than anything he'd ever done in his 12 years of life. His mother's voice echoed in his head. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't doing something big and heroic. Sometimes it's just choosing not to walk away when everyone else does. Taking a deep breath, Tommy let his bag of recyclables drop to the ground. The sound of cans clattering against the bridge's metal surface seemed impossibly loud in the evening quiet. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Tommy didn't think, he just acted. As the sound of his dropped recyclables echoed across the bridge, he noticed the man's foot slip on the wet railing. The world seemed to move in slow motion, like those action movies he sometimes watched through their neighbor's window. "Hey!" Tommy shouted, his voice cracking with fear and urgency. He lunged forward, his worn sneakers squeaking against the wet bridge surface. His small hands grabbed onto the back of the man's expensive suit jacket, pulling with all the strength he could muster. The fabric felt smooth and foreign under his fingers, so different from the rough clothes he was used to. The man, caught off balance, stumbled backward. He was heavy, much heavier than the bags of recyclables Tommy usually carried. For a terrifying moment, Tommy thought they might both go over. His heart was beating so fast it felt like it might burst out of his chest. But somehow, he managed to keep his footing, digging his heels into the bridge's surface. They both tumbled backward, landing hard on the wet concrete of the walkway. Tommy's elbow scraped against the ground, and he felt as the rain continued to fall, a small crowd had gathered on the bridge. Someone had brought over a blanket, draping it around Mr. Blackwood's shoulders. Tommy sat next to him on a nearby bench that a kind police officer had guided them to. The blue and red lights from the police car flashed silently, creating strange patterns in the raindrops. "My wife," Mr. Blackwood began, his voice barely above a whisper. He twisted the gold wedding ring on his finger as he spoke. She loved the rain, said it made everything feel fresh and new. He looked up at the dark sky, letting the raindrops fall on his face. "We used to walk in the rain together. But now," his voice cracked, and he had to take a deep breath before continuing. Tommy listened quietly, remembering how his mom had cried for days after his dad left them 3 years ago. Sometimes people just needed someone to listen. The police officer stood nearby, taking notes but giving them space to talk. "Cancer," Mr. Blackwood said, the word hanging heavy in the air. "We fought it for 2 years. The best doctors, the most expensive treatments. But in the end," he clenched his fists, then slowly released them. All the money in the world couldn't save her. She passed away last week. Tommy felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about how hard it was when his dad left. At least he knew his dad was still out there somewhere. But Mr. Blackwood's wife was gone forever. The thought made his heart hurt. "I'm the CEO of Blackwood Industries," Mr. Blackwood continued, running a shaky hand through his wet hair. "Everyone thinks I have everything. Big house, fancy cars, more money than I could ever spend. But none of it matters without her." He turned to look at Tommy, his eyes filled with tears again. I thought maybe if I just—" "My mom says it's okay to be sad," Tommy interrupted, not wanting to hear the end of that sentence. "She says it means you loved someone a lot." He fidgeted with the tear in his jeans, suddenly feeling very small, but knowing he needed to keep talking. "When my dad left, she cried a lot. But she said we had to keep going, because that's what love is too. Keeping going even when it's really hard." Mr. Blackwood stared at Tommy for a long moment, something changing in his expression. The despair in his eyes slowly gave way to something else. Maybe not hope exactly, but a flicker of recognition, like someone finding a familiar landmark after being lost for a long time. "How old are you?" he asked softly. 12, Tommy replied. "Almost 13, he added, thinking that sounded more grown up. Mr. Blackwood nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. 12 years old, he repeated, shaking his head in amazement. 12 years old and wiser than me. He managed a weak smile, the first one Tommy had seen from him. "My wife would have liked you. She always said the smartest people were the ones who could see with their hearts." The rain was starting to ease up now. A paramedic came over to check on them, but Mr. Blackwood waved them away. "I'm okay now," he said, and for the first time, it sounded like he might actually mean it. "Thanks to this young man, I'm okay now." Tommy thought about what his mom always said about everything happening for a reason. Maybe he was meant to be on the bridge tonight. Maybe all those afternoons collecting recyclables were leading to this moment. He didn't know for sure, but sitting there in the gentle rain, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The next morning, Tommy woke up to unusual sounds outside his window. His mom was already up, peering through their old curtains with a confused look on her face. The street below their small apartment was filled with news vans, their satellite dishes pointing up at the gray morning sky like metal flowers. "Tommy," his mom called softly, still looking out the window. "Do you have something to tell me about what happened yesterday?" She wasn't angry, but her voice had that worried tone she used when she knew something was up. Tommy had come home late last night, soaking wet and quiet, and had gone straight to bed. Before Tommy could answer, there was a knock at their door. His mom opened it to find their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, practically bouncing with excitement. "Turn on the TV," she exclaimed, rushing past them to grab their remote. "Channel 5. They're talking about Tommy." The old TV flickered to life, and there it was, a picture of Tommy and Mr. Blackwood from last night, captured by someone's phone. The headline below read, "Local boy saves prominent CEO." Tommy's mom sank into their worn-out couch, her hand covering her mouth as she listened to the reporter describe how her son had prevented a tragedy on the bridge. More knocks came at the door. Reporters wanted interviews, neighbors wanted to congratulate them, and Tommy's mom kept answering the door in a daze. Their tiny apartment had never seen so many visitors. The building manager even showed up, proudly telling reporters he'd always known that boy was special. Tommy sat on their old couch, still in his pajamas, feeling overwhelmed by all the attention. His mom had called the school to say he'd be late, but now it seemed like going to school might not happen at all. People kept asking him questions, taking his picture, calling him a hero. He just wanted to disappear under his blanket. Then, around mid-morning, a sleek black car pulled up outside. The reporters all turned their cameras toward it, and Tommy's heart started beating faster. He recognized the man stepping out, Mr. Blackwood, looking very different from last night. He was wearing a fresh suit and had a warm smile on his face as he made his way through the crowd. When Mr. Blackwood reached their door, he didn't barge in like the reporters. He knocked politely and waited. Tommy's mom opened the door, looking nervous in her waitress uniform she'd put on for her shift at the diner. Mr. Blackwood introduced himself with a gentle handshake. "I hope you don't mind me coming by," he said, his voice warm but tired. "I wanted to thank your son properly, and to meet the woman who raised such an extraordinary boy." He looked around their small apartment, taking in the worn furniture and the water stains on the ceiling, but his eyes were kind, not judging. Tommy's mom tried to offer him coffee, apologizing that they only had instant, but Mr. Blackwood shook his head. "Please," he said, "sit down. Both of you." He took a seat on their wobbly kitchen chair, looking somehow both out of place and completely at ease. The reporters were still visible through the windows, but inside their apartment, time seemed to slow down. Mr. Blackwood looked at Tommy with the same wonder as last night, but now there was something else in his expression, something that looked like hope, or maybe even excitement. "Your son did more than save my life last night," he said to Tommy's mom, his voice full of emotion. "He reminded me that there's still good in the world, still reasons to keep going." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out an envelope. "And now, if you'll let me, I'd like to return the favor." Tommy and his mom exchanged glances, not knowing that their lives were about to change forever. Outside, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, sending streams of light through their windows, making everything look new and full of possibility. Mr. Blackwood carefully opened the envelope on their small kitchen table. Tommy's mom sat nervously, still in her diner uniform, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The morning light streamed through their dusty window, making the important-looking papers inside glow. First, Mr. Blackwood began, his voice gentle but firm. "I want to offer you a position at Blackwood Industries." He looked at Tommy's mom, whose eyes widened in surprise. "I understand you're working 2 jobs right now. One at the diner and another cleaning offices at night." Tommy watched his mom nod slowly, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. He'd never seen her look so hopeful and scared at the same time. The dark circles under her eyes seemed darker in the morning light, reminding him of all the late nights she'd worked. "The position I'm offering is in our Human Resources Department," Mr. Blackwood continued. "Full benefits, including health insurance, paid vacation, and a salary that's—" He paused, writing down a number on a piece of paper and sliding it across the table. Tommy's mom gasped when she saw it, her hand flying to her mouth. That's more than both my jobs combined," she whispered, her voice shaking. "But I don't have a college degree. I never finished because—" She glanced at Tommy, and he knew she was thinking about how she dropped out when she got pregnant with him. Mr. Blackwood shook his head. "We'll provide all the training you need. What I care about is character, and anyone who raised a son like Tommy has the kind of character I want in my company." He smiled warmly, then pulled out another paper. "And that brings me to the second part." Tommy leaned forward, curious. Mr. Blackwood turned to face him directly. "Young man, you showed incredible courage and compassion last night. Those qualities should be nurtured." He placed another document on the table. "This is a full scholarship fund for your education. Private school now, and college when you're ready. All expenses covered." The room felt very quiet. Tommy could hear his own heart beating. Private school, college, these were things he'd never even dared to dream about. His mom started crying softly, happy tears this time. "There's more," Mr. Blackwood said, his voice getting a bit rougher with emotion. "I'd like to be your mentor, Tommy. Meet with you regularly, guide you, help you grow into the remarkable man I know you'll become." He cleared his throat. "My wife and I, we never had children. But if we had, I would have wanted a son like you." Tommy felt his own eyes getting wet. He thought about all the father-son events at school he'd skipped, all the times he pretended it didn't matter that his dad wasn't around. His mom reached over and squeezed his hand. Of course, Mr. Blackwood added quickly, "This is all your choice. Both of you need to want this. Take time to think about it, discuss it." He was cut off by Tommy's mom. "Yes," she said firmly, wiping her eyes. "Yes to all of it." She looked at Tommy. "If you want this, baby, it's your choice too." Tommy thought about everything. The scholarship, his mom not having to work 2 jobs anymore, having someone to talk to and learn from. He looked at Mr. Blackwood and saw not just a rich businessman, but a person who needed this as much as they did. "Yes," Tommy said quietly, then stronger. "Yes, I want this." Mr. Blackwood's face broke into a genuine smile, reminding Tommy of the sunrise they'd just watched. Outside, the reporters were still waiting, but in their small kitchen, something more important was happening. 3 people, brought together by chance on a bridge, were building something new, something like hope, something like family. Over the next few months, Tommy's life changed in ways he never could have imagined. Gone were the afternoons collecting recyclables on the old bridge. Instead, he found himself walking through the polished hallways of his new school, wearing a crisp uniform that still felt strange against his skin. The move to their new apartment happened quickly. It wasn't anything too fancy. Mr. Blackwood had been careful about that, saying it was important to stay grounded. But it was clean and safe, with working heat and no water stains on the ceiling. Tommy had his own room for the first time in his life, though sometimes he still missed falling asleep to the sound of his mom's late-night TV shows through the thin walls of their old place. His mom was different now, too. Working at Blackwood Industries, she walked taller, smiled more. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, and she'd started taking classes at night. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Tommy often found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by books, studying with the same determination she'd once shown working double shifts. Mr. Blackwood kept his promise about being a mentor. Every Wednesday afternoon, he'd pick Tommy up from school in his black car. They'd go to different places, museums, libraries, sometimes just for a walk in the park. He taught Tommy things that weren't in any school books: how to shake hands properly, how to look people in the eye when speaking, how to believe in himself. Being successful isn't just about money, Mr. Blackwood would say during their talks. It's about understanding people, about seeing their value. He changed too since that night on the bridge. The sadness was still there in his eyes sometimes, but it was softer now, mixed with purpose. Not everything was easy. Some kids at the new school made fun of Tommy's accent, the way he sometimes used wrong words. Others whispered about him being Mr. Blackwood's charity case. But Tommy remembered what his mom always said about keeping his head high. Besides, he was doing well in his classes, especially math, which surprised him. Turned out he was pretty good at numbers when he had time to actually study them. One day, while they were having hot chocolate in a small cafe, Mr. Blackwood had learned it was Tommy's favorite. Tommy asked the question that had been on his mind. "Do you still miss her, your wife?" Mr. Blackwood was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee. "Every day," he finally said. "But you know what? She would have loved all this. She always said life was about passing on kindness, like ripples in a pond." He smiled at Tommy. "You taught me that too, that night on the bridge." Back home, their new neighborhood felt more like home now. Mrs. Chen from their old building visited sometimes, bringing her famous dumplings and marveling at their new place. Tommy's mom had insisted on keeping in touch with their old neighbors, saying it was important to remember where they came from. The biggest change, though, was inside Tommy himself. He no longer felt like the boy who had to grow up too fast, carrying the weight of helping his family survive. Instead, he felt like a kid who was learning, growing, dreaming about the future. He still kept one of his old recyclable bags in his closet, though. Not because he needed it, but to remind himself of where he'd been and how far he'd come. One evening, as Tommy sat doing his homework while his mom cooked dinner, she was home every evening now, he realized something important. Sometimes the best changes in life don't just happen to you, they happen through you, spreading out to touch other lives, like those ripples Mr. Blackwood talked about. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not just save someone else, but let them help save you too. 1 year after that fateful night, Tommy and Mr. Blackwood stood together on the same bridge. The evening was calm, so different from that stormy night that had brought them together. The setting sun painted the sky in beautiful oranges and pinks, reflecting off the water below. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Mr. Blackwood said softly, his hands resting on the railing that he had once gripped with such different intentions. He looked healthier now, his face had more color, and his eyes held a steady warmth instead of that desperate emptiness Tommy remembered. They had chosen this day deliberately. It was the anniversary of their first meeting, but also the anniversary of Mr. Blackwood's wife's passing. Earlier, they had visited her grave together, leaving fresh flowers. Tommy had watched as Mr. Blackwood spoke quietly to the headstone, telling her about his year, about Tommy, about how things were changing. "I started therapy 3 months after that night," Mr. Blackwood said, looking out at the water. He'd never talked about this before. Twice a week at first, now just once. But it helps. He turned to Tommy with a small smile. "You know, the therapist said, she said sometimes we need someone to believe in us before we can believe in ourselves again." Tommy nodded, thinking about his own changes. His grades had improved so much that he'd made the honor roll last semester. His mom had cried when she put that certificate up on their fridge, right next to her own certificate from her business management course. "I've been thinking," Mr. Blackwood continued, "about starting a youth program. Something to help kids like you, not just with money, but with opportunities, mentorship." His eyes got that excited look they always did when he talked about new ideas. "What do you think about helping me design it?" Tommy felt a surge of excitement. He thought about his old friends from the neighborhood, about kids who had dreams, but no way to reach them. "Could we include art classes?" he asked. "My friend Lou has always wanted to learn to paint, but his family couldn't afford supplies." Mr. Blackwood pulled out a small notebook. He'd started carrying one everywhere, jotting down ideas. "Art classes," he wrote, nodding. "What else?" They stood there as the sky darkened, brainstorming ideas. Computer classes for kids who'd never touched a laptop. Music lessons. Tutoring. Even a recycling program, Tommy suggested with a grin, making Mr. Blackwood laugh. "You know," Mr. Blackwood said after a while, putting his notebook away, "when I was at my lowest point that night, I thought I had nothing left to give the world." He looked at Tommy with fatherly pride. "But look at us now, planning ways to help others. My wife would have loved this. She always said that helping others was the best way to heal yourself." A cool breeze ruffled Tommy's hair as they started walking off the bridge. Behind them, a young couple stopped to take pictures of the sunset. A jogger ran past, headphones in. Life went on, simple and ordinary and precious. "Next week," Mr. Blackwood said as they walked, "I'm teaching you about investment portfolios." He chuckled at Tommy's groan. "Hey, you said you wanted to learn everything. But maybe we can get ice cream after." Tommy smiled, remembering how a year ago he'd been counting coins from recycling. Now here he was, learning about investments and helping design a program that could change other kids' lives. The bridge that had once been just part of his recycling route had become something else. A symbol of how life could change in an instant, of how hope could appear in the darkest moments. As they reached the end of the bridge, Tommy looked back one last time. The spot where everything had changed was just a regular piece of sidewalk now. But he knew that sometimes the most important places in our lives don't look special at all. They're just waiting for the right moment to become something more. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book. Tommy stood in front of his high school's packed auditorium, adjusting the student body president pin on his blazer. At 17, he'd grown taller, more confident, but his eyes still held that same kindness that had made him stop on the bridge that night. The audience was a mix of faces. His mom in the front row, beaming with pride in her business suit. She'd been promoted to head of HR last month. Mr. Blackwood sitting beside her. Young students from their youth program scattered throughout the crowd. Tommy took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. 5 years ago, he began, his voice steady. I was a 12-year-old kid collecting recyclables on a bridge. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew his story by now. Today, I'm announcing that our school's peer counseling program has helped over 300 students this year alone. The program had been Tommy's idea, inspired by his own experience. He'd noticed how many students struggled with problems they couldn't talk about at home: stress, anxiety, family issues. The same things that had once driven Mr. Blackwood to that bridge. So Tommy had proposed a solution: train students to be there for each other. Sometimes, he continued, the biggest difference we can make is just being there. Just stopping. Just listening. His eyes met Mr. Blackwood's, who nodded slightly, understanding the deeper meaning. That's why today, I'm excited to announce that 5 other schools in our district are adopting our peer counseling program. The applause was warm, but Tommy wasn't finished. He pulled out a letter from his pocket, the one he'd received yesterday. His hands shook slightly as he held it up. And I have some personal news too. I've been accepted to Yale University with a full scholarship. The auditorium erupted in cheers. His mom was crying happy tears, and Mr. Blackwood was trying to pretend he wasn't wiping his eyes too. But Tommy raised his hand for quiet, because this wasn't just about him. But more importantly, he said, his voice growing stronger, 20 students from our youth center have received college acceptance letters this year. Kids who, like me, might never have had the chance otherwise. He smiled at the younger students in the audience. And this is just the beginning. After the ceremony, they all gathered in the school garden, a project the youth center had helped create. Tommy's mom couldn't stop hugging him, and Mr. Blackwood kept showing everyone the Yale letter like a proud father. The garden was full of people whose lives had somehow been touched by what happened that night on the bridge. You know what's funny? Tommy said later, as they shared cake and memories. Everyone calls me a hero for what I did that night. But really, I was just a kid who didn't want someone to be alone. He looked around at all the faces, his mom laughing with her coworkers, Mr. Blackwood talking with some of the youth center kids, his classmates from the peer counseling program sharing stories. Mr. Blackwood came over and put a hand on Tommy's shoulder. You still don't see it, do you? He said softly. That night, you didn't just save my life. You started a chain reaction of hope. Look around. Every person here has their own story of change, their own bridge moment. Tommy understood what he meant. Each person there had somehow been touched by the ripples of that rainy night. The youth center kids finding their paths, the peer counselors learning to help others, even his mom discovering her own strength and talents. As the evening wound down, Tommy slipped away for a moment to look at the sunset. In a few months, he'd be heading to college, starting a new chapter. But he knew now that endings were just beginnings in disguise. Somewhere out there, other people were having their own bridge moments, their own chances to change a life. All they had to do was stop, reach out, and believe in the power of being there for someone else.